were still empty, the palace itself was bustling with life on the eve of the crown prince's wedding to the marquise's daughter. No servant dared to stay in bed, as everyone needed to contribute to make everything perfect. A ray of sunlight crossed the eyelids of a black-haired girl, making them close tighter, just as a modest question was asked whether the lady had awoken. The brunette opened her emerald eyes and sat up in bed, smiling as she asked her maid if it was time to go to the palace. It was a typical day for an aristocratic lady soon to become empress. A morning bath with rose petals and ladies-in-waiting working on her flawless appearance. However, something was entirely new for the girl who, looking in the mirror, saw not herself and ordinary people nearby, but instead the prince, knights, and mages. And where her reflection should have been, the main villain from a novel she had read a few days ago stared back into her eyes. She had become Eris Miserian, the jealous antagonist who wished to destroy the love between her fiancé and a bankrupted count's daughter at any cost, even at the price of her own life. Girls who dream of being in their favorite fairy tales don't understand that happy and just endings don't come for everyone, and they view these fictional worlds through rose-colored glasses. The current occupant of Eris Miserian's body had a completely different opinion on this matter. She would never love this world. The same soft voice that had spoken to her that morning tried to discern the thoughts of the future empress. Eris simply waved it off, mentioning the slow passage of time and possible thoughts about the wedding. But in her head, a plan was forming. How to return to her own world as quickly as possible without living out the pre-written story of the heroine. Perhaps by ending her life sooner than planned. Thanks to the book, Eris already knew that the crown prince loves not her, but the impoverished count's daughter, Helen. She will become the empress, and Alec will do everything possible to make that happen. Driven mad by envy, the original bride will poison Helen, restoring justice. The one who desperately desired justice and the return of what was taken from her will receive the death penalty, while the prince's beloved will return to life, receiving her happy ending. Though for the current Eris, that would be a good ending if it allows her to return to her own world. After the hunt, the crown prince awaits his future empress, and Eris. She began to descend to the table, where she was met with Alec's indifferent eyes and Helen's friendly smile, who instinctively called her by name before correcting herself to Lady Miserian. The brunette politely smiled, unlike the original Eris, and adjusted her voluminous red dress. The irritated prince sighed, noting her tardiness. Apologizing, the bride took her seat across from the pair. The tea hadn't even had time to cool, much to the relief of the ash-haired commoner beloved by Alec. The prince took note of the formal address to Miserian, disapproving of it and reminding everyone that they are all friends here. Contrary to being rude and leaving the tea, Lady Miserian considered it unnecessary and asked Helen to pour her some tea. The prince sarcastically commented on the bride's lack of independence and hand issues, which he parried with his recent friends comment and etiquette rules, visibly angering the groom. However, the radiance, non-confrontation, and innocence of Helen saved them from a full-blown argument, as these were the beloved traits of readers. Behind them they were embraced by Jason Kajar, the Duke's son and the prince's longtime friend, hopelessly in love with the ash-haired beauty. The red-haired knight later greeted Eris as well, complimenting her beauty. Miserian wished Mr. Kajar a dazzling day, to which he became flustered, thinking he didn't deserve such praise without a heroic deed. The girl, with a barely noticeable smirk, emphasized that the crown prince's bride should speak no less. The groom clenched his jaw, glaring at her for such talk in front of his beloved. His old friend noticed this and reminded him that such behavior was inappropriate in public. Alec justified it by saying he didn't need to care about others' opinions, but Miserian didn't back down and reminded him of the lack of an imperial status. Even the quiet Helen was surprised and tried to calm Eris, disapprovingly calling her name. Everyone sat apart, but together, looking at the brunette with bewilderment and condemnation. Despite being their childhood friend, each addressed her as a stranger. Feeling the pain and offense of this treatment, Lady Miserian was driven to a terrible sin in an attempt to restore justice. But how will the third party in the body of the rejected villain behave? Elise rose from the table, bowing slightly forward in respect and thanking Entoblum for pouring the tea. Helen doubtfully addressed Miserian by name, wondering what was wrong. Why was she leaving? The lady sharply reacted to the Count's daughter's lack of understanding of titles and others' views, reminding her of the obligation to observe etiquette at court and address His and Her Highness according to their status. Entoblum, ashamed, lowered her gaze, unable to respond, and the Crown Prince defended her, slamming his fist on the table. With a question about how Miserian dared to criticize Helen in his presence, he was about to stand up, but the ash-haired woman grabbed the prince's hand. Alec wanted to object to her in bewilderment, but Entoblum declared that she was fine. The villain smirked as she observed the innocence of the heroine's kind and forgiving soul, unaware of how everyone was ready to give their lives for her smile. Therefore, Elise left without saying another word, deciding that there should be at least one exception to the rules. On a hot, sunny day, it was particularly uncomfortable with makeup and heavy, unfamiliar jewelry. Moreover, those that would never suit her true nature. However, Elise thought the weather was sunny and beautiful. So when the coachman asked if she had a good time, she, albeit with a slight delay, answered positively and ordered to drive home. As the lady had already noted, the weather was wonderful for another attempt to end life and return to her own. However, it didn't happen. After many attempted methods, her plan wasn't succeeding. From her very first day in the novel, the desire to return was stronger than fear. Neither the height of the balcony, nor the vial of poison, nor even the sharp dagger could help the poor lady return to her body, as if the world itself couldn't let her go or change poor Elise's fate, or didn't want to. In the first case, she would be caught by the horsekeeper, who assumed it was an unsuccessful attempt to get some air. In the second, the lethal liquid turned out to be just a strong sleeping potion, and in the case of what seemed the most reliable method, thanks to the doctor, there were no serious health problems. Just servants were alarmed, not understanding who could have attacked their mistress. Absolutely nothing allowed her to even progress with leaving the novel. She was locked up like a bird in a cage, amusing everyone around with desperate and pitiful attempts to fly away. Only one idea remained viable that could help her, and if it worked, she wouldn't be alone. Miserian asked her maid, Emma, to find a powerful fortune teller, strictly ordering her to do it so that not a single soul would know. If the world uses supernatural forces to restrain her, why shouldn't she do the same for a fair game? Preparing for the fateful meeting with her only chance of salvation, the girl decided to dress lighter, compensating for the heavy mourning. However, the servants insisted that their mistress always look perfect, even on a light walk. Perhaps she should clear her mind and pick more suitable jewelry, dresses. The maids even recommended a shop where Elise could enjoy a delicious dessert, though perhaps they were trying to ask for cookies for themselves this way, but in any case, it worked. However, to maintain Miserian's image, the girl threatened that if she didn't like the sweets, she wouldn't bring them any and would scold everyone. In reality, she was amazed by the servants' devotion and love for their mistress, and strongly doubted whether they received even a fraction of a percent from her in return. Probably this world was closer to modern. The gatekeepers and guards on the streets had pistols. Lamps powered by magical engineering were shining, which was quite ironic, as the mages themselves were expelled, but their technologies were quite extensively used. When the coachman and guard announced they had arrived, she got out and waved them off, saying she wanted to walk alone. At their attempt to convince the mistress otherwise, justifying it with what the young man considered a recent attack on the lady, Miserian irritably told them to return, making it clear she wouldn't repeat twice. The guard looked around in confusion. The street was empty. Giving up, he said he would stay in the vicinity and pick her up, which Elise agreed to. Arriving at the address of her salvation, she stepped onto the creaking floor of the wooden shack. The room looked unusual but cozy. Large bookcases full of books, tables covered with numerous candles, exhibits behind locked glass, a pedestal with an open book, and the next room was hung with red curtains and a blue curtain of large beads, hiding it from prying eyes. A slightly tart but pleasant smell came from small cauldrons and liquid distillation devices. Doubts were fading. Was this really a fortune-teller's place? Though perhaps all these strange objects were for show and to attract clients. Elise reached for the book to familiarize herself with it, but a velvety, mysterious voice advised against doing so. From the mysterious room emerged an equally mysterious girl with sapphire eyes, which were emphasized by an amulet with a sky-blue gemstone and pleasantly contrasted with the amber-red, lush strands on her face. The dark blue dress accentuated her figure, and a shawl covered her shoulders. Elise pulled back her hand and turned to the stranger, and after a second got down to business, deciding to test the fortune-teller with a simple question. Did she know why she needed to seek such services? The fortune-teller answered affirmatively without changing expression, even mentioning her surname, which in fact didn't inspire much confidence, as many knew about the Crown Prince's bride. However, when, with an interested look, she raised an eyebrow and called Elise an unfortunate stranger, things became much more interesting. The lady was stunned, clearly unprepared to hear such things right away. The fortune-teller didn't waste any time and grabbed the girl's hand, ordering her to follow while ignoring Alice's uncertainty. The room behind the curtain was just as peculiar as the previous one, with dried herbs, vessels, and bottles containing unknown substances. The stranger, now deeply focused on questioning the red-haired lady, emphasized her hope that the fortune-teller already knew everything, which would make the task easier, to help her return. Unfortunately, the fortune-teller stated that her wish wasn't as easily fulfilled as she hoped, reminding her of past, seemingly radical attempts that had failed, which she learned about through her soul scent. Even after asking again, the stranger didn't get a more detailed answer, only an explanation that the attempt failed because of trying to tear her soul apart by herself. Now Alice was certain these words weren't just guesswork. The fortune-teller asked her to wait, then began sorting through bottles and mixing liquids in a boiling pot. Afterward, under her guest's silent, questioning gaze, she poured the mixture into a bowl. Miserian looked with disgust at the offered bowl, which she was supposed to drink from. When she asked if the potion maker knew what it was, she joked that it didn't matter, and wouldn't it be good even if it might be poison? After hesitating and examining the liquid suspiciously, Alice risked following the fortune-teller's request and emptied the bowl completely, but immediately regretted her decision. The horrible taste burned her mouth, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by nausea. The fortune-teller quickly offered her guest some jelly, which she said would help with the unpleasant side effects. The stranger was suspicious of this, remembering the carrot and stick method. Finally, the fortune-teller sat opposite her, smoothly getting to the point, and mentioning that she wasn't an ordinary fortune-teller. When Miserian raised her eyebrow, she snapped her fingers, and immediately a blue, mesmerizing flame appeared in her palm. Bringing it closer to Alice, the stranger finally decided to introduce herself as Medea, the last witch in these lands. The stranger was shocked. There hadn't been any mention of witches in the novel. Medea, noticing the girl's confusion, suggested she had many questions in her head, but couldn't promise to answer everything. First, Alice asked why she was the last one, to which she received the obvious answer: everyone had fled this empire for their own safety, those who survived. Delving into witch history, the fortune-teller shared that despite having names, none had surnames because they don't have offspring. It happens, but very rarely, as witches value individuality and freedom more. As a sign of respect, they address each other only by first names and consider themselves sisters. Alice wanted to clarify many things about this world's unexplored territory, but it was more important to ask the main question. Was there any way for her to return to her world? The witch slightly raised the corner of her mouth, obviously expecting this question. The answer was that the sisters could save her, but for a good price, the willingness to experience death again, which Alice had already tried to achieve before. However, Medea would need to contact other witches for permission with such a unique case. Miserian, without thinking about the need to decide on this frightening trial, only asked when everything would be ready for her return. The fortune teller, after thinking, stated a time frame of 2 weeks, assuming urgency, and hoped for the lady's understanding, since gathering responses from all continents where the sisters had settled would take more than a day. But doubt crept into the stranger, and she uncertainly asked the only person she could voice it to, nervously gripping her dress fabric. What would happen if she couldn't overcome her fear of death, if she didn't want to feel it again? Unfortunately, no clear or encouraging answer followed, only sympathy and an explanation that magic, unlike priests' theology, doesn't always serve good purposes. Therefore, if she believed in miracles, she should go to a temple, though without guarantee that this would be the true, necessary, or even possible path for her. The lady stood up, stating she understood her words, and placed a pouch with jingling contents on the table. Although the fortune teller said the stranger didn't need to pay for the service, Alice insisted, saying it was for her comfort. After all, it was a kind of guarantee they would keep each other's secrets, since Medea had a much more terrible secret if it fell into the wrong hands. Understanding her position, the fortune teller took the money pouch, saying she would accept the price of her own life. She also advised keeping a mirror nearby in case Medea needed to contact the stranger. On the way back to the shop, her head was filled with many thoughts. This was the first completely new character or villain in this world. How many more would she meet during her 2 weeks of survival here? She would probably have to find answers to questions only with time, and thinking about the usefulness of acquaintances now was pointless. Coming out of her thoughtful state, Miserian noticed that the street was too crowded today, and the reason was that same cookie shop the maids had talked about. Deciding this wouldn't do, and having no particular desire to stand in a huge line for cookies, the girl turned around, deciding to come back another day. But almost immediately after she turned, she was pushed by a hurrying person so hard that the lady stumbled and nearly fell. But someone's strong hands managed to catch her by the shoulders. At the caring question from a dark-skinned, dark-haired young man asking if Alice was all right, she was slightly taken aback. He released her shoulders after making sure she was steady on her feet, emphasizing that she had nearly gotten into trouble. Miserian turned to him, looking closely and confirming that this was Helena's savior, who had prayed for the real Alice to burn in hell's boiling cauldron. High Priest Hybris, not yet knowing that he would soon become the main rival of the novel's primary villain. The future sworn enemies stood in silence for a moment, but suddenly his expression shifted, and in an instant he was leaning over her, studying her intently. Yet Alice held firm against his penetrating gaze, refusing to look away, until his quiet, menacing question, "Who is she?" Her heart faltered. His dark eyes seemed to pierce through her, studying her very essence, burning through her defenses until she could barely breathe. He examined her methodically, as if she were some fascinating tome holding answers he desperately sought. Her mind raced chaotically as she rapidly weighed her options and their consequences, even considering revealing everything and, as Medea had suggested, testing her fortune at the temple. In the novel, Hybris was one of the central characters, the one who resurrects Helena from death, using all sacred powers at his disposal, while fervently praying for Miserian's damnation. He stood as Alice's perfect antithesis, the true hero who had liberated the Empire from its heartless villain. As High Priest, should he discover her true identity, he might subject her to experiments, or worse, inform the Crown Prince, providing yet another reason for mockery, or perhaps even orchestrate her imprisonment in some distant castle. This visitor from another world would never allow such a fate, not when she'd finally made progress towards solving her predicament by consulting the witch. These past 2 weeks would have been better spent avoiding any involvement at all. Believing attack to be the best defense, she frowned and loudly challenged the propriety of a priest being acquainted with an unmarried noblewoman. The young man retreated, protesting that he hadn't been referring to her title. to her obvious demand of what he had meant then. He averted his gaze, now convinced he faced the prince's bride herself, internally questioning what such an esteemed person could be doing among the crowd before a shop. Hesitating and concerned for his reputation, Hybris attempted to guide the lady to a more private location to avoid awkwardness. After all, the Marquise's daughter and future empress was well known, and naturally, her raised voice in conversation with a priest would cause quite a stir. Alice continued pressing him, demanding explanations for his unwarranted questioning. The poor young man recoiled, insisting this was no interrogation, that he would never dare such presumption. But Miserian maintained that his behavior was far from a casual inquiry, as she advanced threateningly toward him. After all, should she act inappropriately toward him, her gender wouldn't excuse such behavior, would it? Finally yielding to her pressure, he admitted his mistake and offered apologies, which Alice accepted, ceasing her offensive and proceeding past him toward her waiting coachman, while the high priest could only watch her departure. During her journey home, the stranger reflected deeply on the encounter, regretting her harsh treatment of Hybris. Should she have confessed? Perhaps this had been her opportunity to establish ties with the temple, should she need to deviate from the original narrative or the witch's method of return. Miserian chided herself for overreacting. The high priest's assistance could have proved valuable. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. To return to her world, one she'd never intended to leave, she must experience death not once, but multiple times. Given the choice between apologizing to a man who despised her and enduring those horrific sensations, Alice would readily choose the former. If only she could remember what was yet to come. All she could do now was pray for another chance encounter with him. The carriage approached the palace under the star-studded dome of night, forcing her to set aside her contemplations. Alice stepped down from the carriage, and her accompanying guard reminded her of the upcoming night's investiture, suggesting she select a personal guardian for her safety. Without her genuine interest, the ceremony would be meaningless, though perhaps she ought to reconsider her stance. Having personal guards wouldn't bind her to any obligations, but would offer convenience in both public affairs and private matters. Miserian pondered this briefly, but, certain of her imminent departure from this realm, declined to surround herself with additional attendants. The knight shrugged, acknowledging he wouldn't contradict her decision, but noted that many would eagerly serve as the lady's personal guard, dedicating their lives to such a beautiful woman. Alice merely smirked, highlighting the foolishness of such romantic notions. His words rang hollow, suggesting beauty alone warranted protection. Moreover, she questioned whether a personal knight was little more than a slave, whose life would be risked in place of her own. Certainly not what this otherworldly visitor desired. After all, she believed the paramount principle was to dedicate one's life to oneself alone, never surrendering control to another. Whether becoming or bearing the responsibility for another's life, both paths led to danger and hardship. The novel's reader strained to recall every detail about Hybris, even such minor facts as his weakness for confectionery. But fear of judgment over a high priest pursuing such frivolous luxuries overwhelmed his desires, forcing him to indulge only in utmost secrecy. Helen had been the first to discover this and, wishing to help, summoned him from the temple simply to share some cookies. She had remembered him while passing the shop, having spotted him in the confectioner's queue. Sweets had always lifted her spirits, as did giving gifts to others, so she reasoned both she and Hybris would find joy in her gesture. The high priest had been profoundly moved by this thoughtful act. Through her kindness, he finally found freedom from his rigid constraints and learned to accept his own preferences. This led to Hybris's first experience of love, tragically unrequited. His uncertain lingering at the shop just yesterday confirmed these events had yet to unfold. If Alice required the high priest's support, she must act decisively before anyone else. Otherwise, she could consider her gambit lost. As a high priest devoted to his principles and character, he would maintain her confidences if asked. Miserian was already strategizing how to outmaneuver Helen. Logic suggested visiting the shop, hoping to catch him again during his sweet-tooth contemplations. Though she hadn't dismissed the possibility of encountering him at the palace and immediately requesting his discretion regarding their future conversation, she worried about unwanted listeners, including the prince himself. He might then report her perceived infidelity to the emperor, triggering consequences she couldn't predict. While this would wound the prince, it served no purpose, as Alice had no intention of disrupting Helen's romantic destiny. Therefore, her mission became clear: locate Hybris at the confectionery. Just as she prepared to depart, a knock at her door inquired whether she had awakened. She learned she must hasten her preparations, as the emperor himself had commanded her presence at the palace today. Alice's brow furrowed with suspicion as she wondered about the summons. What could His Majesty want with her at the palace? Soon after, Miserian curtsied before the emperor, spreading the skirt of her luxurious purple gown as she greeted him. His Majesty courteously apologized for the sudden summons, inquiring whether it had caused any inconvenience. Alice assured him that a summons from the emperor could never be a burden, and that she was only pleased to comply, omitting any mention of the rushed and difficult preparations for her journey to the palace. His Highness noted her eloquence and got straight to the point: her coming-of-age ceremony, which he intended to hold in the palace. This decision was likely driven by his desire to quash rumors suggesting that the prince was neglecting his fiancée in favor of a commoner, thereby damaging both his reputation and that of Marquis Miserian. The Marquis, tense and bewildered, questioned the servants to find out whether the emperor was aware of this situation. When one of them hesitated, Alice's father silently clenched his fists, his anger reaching a boiling point. After all, the marriage was meant to be a critical political move, uniting the emperor's forces with the aristocracy. It was essential to convince the public that the union was fully legitimate, which made holding a ceremonial display at the palace a necessary step. However, the lady chose to see it as a gift, warmly thanking His Majesty on behalf of her entire family for such an honor. There was no point in arguing, his word was law. The emperor then inquired of the future empress about Helen, the daughter of Alecto, the nanny. All Miserian could say was that they used to play dolls together with Knight Kaihar and the prince. Pondering this, His Majesty emphasized that the future empress had made a mistake by allowing Count Enteblem's wife to appear at the palace, condemning her actions. Despite his ostentatious care for his grandson, the emperor was a tyrant who had personally killed his own son and sentenced the first prince to execution for an unproven rebellion. The empress, accused of the same offenses, survived only because she was carrying the current prince. Having just lost her first son, she found a nanny for the second in a situation similar to her own. His Highness asked with interest whether Alice was jealous of Helen, to which she gave a negative response, one that the emperor approved. After all, he said, there was nothing to be concerned about. He requested Miserian to come closer to him. Alice complied and knelt before him. Taking her hand in his, he told her that love is fleeting and far less important than the position and power one can gain from another. He continued to reassure her that everything would be fine, thanks to their agreement with her father, and that Alice had no reason to worry since her destiny was to become the prince's wife and the future empress, something no one could change or interfere with. This, he emphasized, would lead to the rise of her family's power, to the presence of her people in the palace, and to the boundless authority her son would wield in the future. He asked whether Miserian fully understood the meaning of his words, which at first seemed comforting, but in reality carried a significant threat: the absolute necessity for her, and no one else, to become the crown prince's wife. Alice agreed with his words, effectively signing her death warrant, with no option to refuse or retract them. The emperor took note of this. However, the foreigner harbored deep doubts about fulfilling his conditions. For the most part, she cared little for either death or the Miserian family. Perhaps she should visit her fiancé before her departure to avoid future complications. But Alice decided that today was not the best day for that, and that it would be better to focus her attention on Hybris. Besides, after enduring her grandfather's long lecture about the wedding, her patience was wearing thin, and if the prince were to say something foolish, it would be exceedingly difficult for her to maintain her composure. Suddenly, someone grabbed her by the shoulder, causing Alice to instinctively recoil and push the potential threat away as she turned to face it. With a startled cry, she demanded to know who it was, only to see Helen on the ground, letting out a small gasp. In surprise, Miserian remarked that Lady Entoblom had frightened her and reminded her that running in the palace was forbidden. The commoner hastily explained that she had only wanted to greet her in this way, to which Alice responded somewhat curtly, pointing out that she could have simply called out instead of behaving like a child. Helen stammered nervously that Alec liked it when she did so, greatly disappointing Alice with her childish behavior. Noticing Helen's hand, which she had injured during the fall, Alice softened and extended a hand to help her up. Entoblom waved off the injury, saying the palace physician would patch her up. Surprising the foreigner greatly, would a doctor of the imperial family attend to a commoner? But when Helen mentioned that the physician treated her well, Alice realized there was no need to worry, except perhaps about being punished for causing injury to the prince's truly beloved girl. This deeply irritated and angered the marquise's daughter, so she tried to leave, stating that she was furious and that Helen annoyed her. When Helen attempted to apologize, Miserian once again noted her lack of formality and asked Entoblom to consider that, despite her status as a commoner, the future empress addressed her tactfully. She could very well address her as a maid or servant, someone unworthy of even a glance, but she refrained from doing so only because of the prince and emperor's fondness for her, nothing more. Helen wanted to protest, to remind Alice that they were friends, but the reader knew what was in the heroine's mind. Her memories held only Alecto and Iason. There was no mention of Alice, confirming the lack of a genuine friendship between them, unless one counted the possibility of Miserian being included solely to serve as an antagonist. In that case, the Marquis's daughter declared that it would be better if they didn't try to be friends at all, leaving the commoner confused. Alice bluntly stated that she had no desire to be Entoblom's friend, and such a possibility was ruled out from the very beginning due to their respective origins. Helen suggested that these words stemmed from her relationship with the prince. This greatly disappointed the foreigner. How could anyone assume she was jealous or saying such things because of some man she couldn't care less about? Despite Entoblom's beauty, it didn't mean she could be allowed to do whatever she pleased. Alice, reiterating that there was no reason for them to be friends, once again asked her to stop trying, but suddenly her hand was seized again. A familiar, irritating voice rang out, commenting that she was as insufferable as ever, or, to be more precise, getting even worse. Miserian, pressing her lips together, greeted Alecto, and reminded him about proper etiquette and morals. The prince, however, snapped back, accusing her of flaunting her status before him. His fiancée asserted her right to do so, as his betrothed. Alecto angrily retorted that it was merely an engagement, not something irrevocable or binding, and reminded her that she wasn't the only candidate. But Alice countered by questioning whether the emperor would agree with that sentiment. She pulled her hand away, and the prince smirked, remarking that she already seemed to fancy herself his wife, bowing before the emperor to earn his favor, as if that was all she was capable of. Helen took his hand, trying to calm him down and take the blame upon herself. Only then did he notice the scratches on her hands, no longer paying attention to her explanations that Miserian had merely been reminding her of proper etiquette. He asked the fateful question, who dared to injure Helen? Entoblom tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, but suddenly a shout came from behind, calling the Marquise's daughter by her full name. A maid, the one who had originally summoned Alecto, claimed she had seen his fiancée push the commoner. The foreigner narrowed her eyes, wondering why the maid hadn't mentioned that Helen had startled her in the first place, but it no longer mattered. Alecto approached Entoblom's offender, despite Helen's desperate attempts to stop him. Miserian's vision blurred as a sharp slap landed on her cheek, leaving a stinging mark and muffling her hearing. Helen covered her mouth in horror. Alice, her hands trembling, pressed her palm against her burning cheek, unable to believe what had just happened. The prince, his hand still raised, declared that now things were even, weren't they? She had hurt someone who belonged to him, so he hurt her in return. His eyes reflected nothing but coldness, hatred, and disdain toward her. After the prince's words about fairness, Alice, rubbing her sore cheek, thought to herself that in that case it would have been much more just to ask Helen to hit her. The reader remembered this scene from the very book, and even when first meeting her, there was confusion about the existence of such psychopaths. But now, having experienced his actions firsthand, one could confidently say that the crown prince was nothing but a bastard. Regaining her composure and pulling her hand away from her burning cheek, she briefly considered striking the bastard back, just as he had struck her, but the only thing stopping her was the possible prospect of ending up in prison and never returning. Therefore, she had to continue behaving like Alice. Alecto had already intended to lead the frightened Helen away, but his fiancée sharply reminded him of the agreement between the emperor and her family, once again drawing his cold gaze toward her. She calmly declared that her marriage was not with him, but with the palace, and that his desires were not a priority, nor were her own. The girl showed the assertiveness and pride that, in her opinion, were characteristic of the daughter of Marquis Miserian. The crown prince raised an eyebrow and mockingly asked again, "After all, if you recall her words about love, the situation becomes quite interesting. Wasn't that her true intention?" For a moment, the girl was taken aback. What had Alice not done to fulfill her duty? Was any of it even a bit true? At the end of the novel, Helen confidently stated that Lady Miserian did not feel love for Alecto, but she could not speak the truth for sure, not truly knowing her, just like the reader. Therefore, if her words were not a lie, it was necessary to protect the true feelings of Alice. Without changing her expression, she sharply declared that, after his behavior, no trace of her love remained, surprising her fiancé and possibly making him feel a slight sting of his great guilt, reminding him that the wedding was not their choice, but a necessity dictated by their father's will. She declared that if he truly wished to break the bond, he should not direct his anger at his fiancée, but instead fall to his knees and beg the emperor for great mercy, though perhaps he didn't even need to make that decision. After the commotion Alecto caused, the emperor would soon find out everything. Meeting the crown prince's irritated gaze and seeing that he had nothing to say in response, Miserian proudly lifted her chin and walked away, leaving her fiancé and Helen in confusion, watching her retreat. Leaving the opulent palace behind, Alice descended the stairs to meet her guard, who noticed the flushed cheek of his mistress. Before any question could be asked, she ordered to be taken home, but it turned out that Kadar was already in the carriage. Miserian rolled her eyes at the exhaustion of their company, but still climbed into the carriage with the young man, who greeted her, but he faltered halfway through his sentence. Alice warned him not to ask about her cheek, as it was none of his business, to which the young man immediately gave in. When asked why he was there, he shrugged, explaining that Duke Kadar had sent him to clarify some matters with Marquis Miserian regarding the upcoming knight investiture, and he was the only free person at the estate. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he borrowed a spot in the lady's carriage. After all the time spent traveling, he was tired of the horses. When asked in confusion why not request a carriage from the palace, the knight winked slyly, saying that they didn't have such beautiful ladies. Alice didn't react to his words, though she noted that the knight mercenary certainly had a sharp tongue. The young lady politely inquired if there were any upcoming travels, but Jason didn't know. After dealing with Mother Nature and the dragon, he wanted to stay home for a while, in the capital. After such events, some dragons hated him, and he would prefer to lay low for a while, in safety. Although the book emphasized that his return was driven by a desire to see Helena, in reality, it seemed there were more reasons. Due to the High Priest's prophecies about the Dragon Slayer, since childhood, he had been subjected to harsh training as the future hero of the Kadar lineage, which had produced the best generals. The novel began with Jason's return to the palace, but of course for his love, the main heroine, a childhood friend who saw not the shield and sword, but Jason himself. The contrast in how they both viewed him sparked love in the heart of the tortured young man. Perhaps he was that character introduced merely as an obstacle in the relationship between Alec and Helena, but it seems there's a separate reason why he's a dragon slayer. Alice turned to the knight, with a request to tell her more about himself, while there was still time before they reached the estate. Jason was surprised by the girl's interest in his story, but to his delight, Lady Miserian dismissed it, claiming she was only avoiding his own questions about her. Saying that the reason wasn't all that important, he crossed his arms, pondering where to begin his tale. Quickly skipping over the prophecy given to him at birth about the Dragon Slayer, since that was well known far beyond the Empire, Jason began speaking of the brutal training he endured from the earliest days of his childhood, of the sword in his hands from his very first steps, the absence of even the slightest rest, how he sometimes blamed his parents, but ultimately came to the conclusion that it was all done for his own protection. However, the exhausted child could not have known that, and so he often thought that perhaps it would have been better if he had simply disappeared. Jason, like everyone in the Empire, knew his destiny to slay the dragon, but when exactly that would happen was anyone's guess. They sense a threat from those who have received the prophecy, so it would make sense if they came to where the Dragon Slayer is and attacked. This meant the Kajar family estate could be at risk, something young Jason could not allow, and to avoid the danger, he began to wander. Even if it was to gain strength, there are now doubts that there wasn't another reason for it. for the young man, with his complicated fate sitting by the crackling fire, often wondered if death might be a relatively good outcome. The only light in his eyes burned when he remembered Helen, the only one who showed him care. Even if now everything had returned to where it once was, his feelings, and the knight himself, so much had changed because of the many different people he met during his travels. But there was one meeting that stood out as the brightest and most important. Through the crowd, casting a glance out the window of the carriage at the fair-haired, beautiful princess of the neighboring country. Although no, it wasn't her. Alice raised an eyebrow in disbelief, realizing that this ladies' man was lying to her again, and asked how much of it was true. Jason proudly declared that rumors about them had even reached the capital, to which the lady chastised him, saying he had done it on purpose, stirring up a commotion. The knight blushed slightly and dropped the subject, and now, with seriousness, he stated that his best meeting had been with the dragon itself. Like something from a fairy tale, Jason crossed mountains, swamps, rivers, and fields before encountering it, so vast and majestic that one begins to doubt if anything, or anyone, could be as enormous. If his words were to be believed, the knight's view of everything was even grander due to his sense of duty and fear, especially of his fate. He gripped his sword tighter in his hands, showing his resolve and desires to live, to escape, discontent with what was happening and the fate assigned to him. All the discomfort came only after facing the dragon head-on. Maybe it was because of the sense of imminent death, for even in a fair fight, it seemed unlikely he could return to normal afterward. However, this encounter happened in a way entirely different from what young Kajar had expected. The dragon greeted Jason, glad that he had finally come, though, compared to the entirety of its long life, the wait was but a moment. It felt like an eternity. To the surprised question about the dragon's knowledge, it declared that the revelation was not given by God, but by itself. Manipulating the priest, it had condemned itself to death at the hands of Kajar. The life of the young man, on the other hand, was merely a sacrifice, the whim of fate. For its own death, it had broken all the laws of cause and effect. The most powerful creature, created by nature, had tricked it. But of course it paid the price for its crime. Suddenly it burst into a brilliant flash of light, and before the dragon slayer's eyes, its form, along with the fear of it, disappeared, leaving behind only the heart that needed to be cleaved. Without hesitation, Jason stepped forward, gripping his sword tighter, and raising it high, he plunged it into the glowing white heart, which burst forth with white blood and exploded with a loud crash. Afterward, everything shook, even the very core of the earth, and the young Kajar had his life restored. Alice listened carefully to the knight's story, but she still couldn't understand his feelings. What intrigued her most was the fact that the dragon had manipulated the high priest, and the breaking of the laws of cause and effect, which should have prevented such a crime. Was it possible that the reader would need to resort to the same method? Could his tale become her guiding thread? She asked if anything was known about the high priest, and what the supreme being meant by the laws, and Kajar mentioned the name Mateus, but noted that he had long since grown old and returned to his homeland, and that Jason too knew nothing of the world's laws. The dragon had only answered his question in vague terms, offering no specifics even about the dragon slayer's fate. However, given its knowledge and experience, it was unlikely that an ordinary mortal could comprehend the truth, even if it were spoken aloud. So, once again, there was nothing useful for the reader, and further questioning might raise suspicions, so she decided to find the rest out on her own, pretending that her interest had already been satisfied. Suddenly, the knight spoke of a surprising closeness that had appeared, drawing a puzzled glance from Lady Miserian. He gently reproached Alice for her coldness, and convincingly asked her to reconsider her attitude toward him, piercing her with his gaze, yet not changing his polite smile when addressing her. Such behavior from the lady's man-knight was bound to surprise the young woman. With his love for Helen, he dares to flirt with Alice herself, whom he could barely even call a friend. Coldly smiling, she corrected Jason, emphasizing that the closeness was far too small for a relationship of such a kind as between the inferior and the superior. This upset the knight, and he began to resemble a puppy that had been scolded, but it had no effect on Alice. After all, he wasn't a real dog. The carriage stopped in front of the palace, the windows reflecting the amber hue of the setting sun. Stepping down first, the knight extended his hand to the lady, offering assistance to the young woman, who, after a few seconds of hesitation, reached out her palm. The young man suddenly turned to Lady Miserian with a request not to be angry with such inexperienced people, who hardly ever leave the grounds of the imperial palace. Alice sharply retorted that such circumstances didn't absolve one from responsibility, and yanked her hand from his grip, then warned Kajar that her father was in his study, and politely bid him farewell, bowing her head and lifting her skirt, wishing him well in his affairs. Resigning himself to what had happened, the knight also bowed, placing his hand on his heart, concluding their meeting. The maid, with a look of fear, noticed the lady's swollen cheek, and even the excuses that everything was fine did little to reassure her. A minute later, she was already holding a cool compress, gently pressing it to the swelling on the lady's face, in an attempt to hide it before dinner with the Marquis. Alice asked again about dinner, and the maid pointed out that they hadn't dined together in a while. It wasn't difficult for the reader to play the role of Lady Miserian, but meeting the Marquis, her new father, was quite uncomfortable. The table was quiet, only the crackling of the fire and the clinking of silverware against plates could be heard, as Alice stole a glance at the Marquis, who was calmly eating his meal. But then, suddenly, he turned to her, causing her to flinch. He asked her to confirm the truth of her intentions not to appoint a personal knight, to which the young woman replied that she would be fine with just regular soldiers and guards to accompany her. However, her father insisted on a visit to the investiture, unless she had a special reason for refusal. He pointed out that many people, not of noble birth, become knights for their careers, but due to their origins, they face significant restrictions that prevent them from being prioritized in the selection process. For the sake of good relations, many choose warriors from influential families, who value only their own lives and their own secrets, no one else's. There are even cases where knights hold a higher status than their lord, and the lord indulges them, despite the contradictions with the knight's direct duties. Her father began listing the main advantages of having a knight: the ability to send him to places she couldn't go herself, to command him to do what couldn't be trusted to anyone else, and be sure that no one would ever know of it, to have a person who, in case of need, would give their life for hers. The knight's primary duties made Alice flinch. The Eris Miserian, who was skilled in manipulation, would undoubtedly find such an opportunity useful, so this excellent proposal could only come from her father, who knew his daughter well. For a moment, it even seemed as if he weren't speaking to her, not to his own daughter, but to the reader, who had found herself in her body. She couldn't be entirely like the real Alice in everything. Her habits, her preferences, her tastes, everything had suddenly changed. Her father, who lived with her and loved her, couldn't help but notice the contrast and guess that something was wrong. Suddenly, a foolish thought crossed her mind: to apologize for the accidental kidnapping of his daughter's body, but thoughts about the risks of being thrown out filled her head. Would he try to find out anything about his real daughter, or would he call her a witch and torture her? That was far more terrifying than the risk of being exposed by High Priest Hybris. Perhaps it was because of the sense of duty for the lost, beloved member of his family. The young woman became so lost in her thoughts that she didn't even notice the Marquis standing up and approaching her, gazing at her thoughtfully, and it was only the gentle pat of her father's hand on her shoulder that brought her out of her trance. Such a light, fleeting touch just before his departure from the room, but, unexpectedly, it was so significant for the reader. Lowering her head, she quietly whispered with only her lips how much she missed her real father, and her mind swirled with various thoughts about what had happened to the real her. Was she alive or dead? Had she disappeared? Were her parents looking for her? Would they ever find and see their daughter again? Overcome with emotions, she buried her face in her hands, admitting to herself just how scared she was and how badly she wanted to go back. Unnoticed, the maid watched from behind the curtain, wondering what was happening to her dear lady. Emma had been a servant in the Marquis Miserian's household since the day the mistress was born. She even remembered the day she gently cradled baby Alice for the first time, while the little one slept peacefully. Emma thought of the child as an angel, enchanted by her boundless charm, snow-white skin, and rosy cheeks. Perhaps she believed that all children were so beautiful, but the moment her fingers brushed the infant's cheek, the child's emerald eyes opened wide, and she burst into a melodious laugh, weakly gripping Emma's finger in her tiny fist. Overwhelmed by her beauty and sweetness, Emma fell deeply in love with her mistress, earnestly wishing her a life of unbroken happiness, free from sorrow. With each passing year, month, even day, Alice grew more beautiful. Though everyone in the palace insisted that the maid Helena was the most stunning of all, Emma was certain such claims only came from those who had never laid eyes on her mistress. When the artist arrived to paint Lady Miserian's portrait, it was yet another chance to marvel at her extraordinary beauty. Her jet-black hair had grown to her waist, the strands framing a snow-white, solemn face with a sharp chin and slightly upturned nose. Her deep emerald eyes, reminiscent of a dense forest on a sweltering summer day, pierced through, studying one's soul, standing out as vividly as her lips, which could be compared to the delicate petals of a rose. The maid was certain that anyone who looked upon her mistress, as she did, would want to give their heart to Alice without hesitation. In Emma's eyes, she had always been an angel. As the only daughter of one of the most influential families in the empire, Lady Miserian received only the best. Perhaps it was because of these privileges and the bitter envy they inspired that she was neither liked nor regarded as someone who deserved, in their eyes, such an easy and blissful life. On one particular day, a maid was assisting her lady as she prepared for the ball at the imperial palace, but her ears caught a discussion about her mistress's family name, and she suddenly froze. 3 people were gossiping, saying that Lady Miserian had become conceited and was already acting like the crown prince's wife just because they were engaged. Alice overheard their spiteful whispers mixed with irritating laughter, while Emma watched her mistress with sadness, powerless to intervene. However, when her mistress ordered the maid to stay behind and strode toward the insolent group, Emma grew alarmed, reaching out her hand as if trying to prevent what was about to happen. Approaching the group, Alice immediately pointed out their shameless, ignoble behavior, which was unbefitting of noble families. With her head held high, Alice put the gossips in their place, reminding them that they were on the grounds of the sacred palace and had the audacity to slander the future crown princess, and by extension, the imperial court itself. Perhaps she should report this to His Majesty to safeguard the palace from slander and degradation. But the gossips began pleading with Lady Miserian for mercy and forgiveness. Emma had long understood that Alice would never mold herself into a girl who was agreeable to everyone, especially not to those who refused to acknowledge her. On the contrary, she often seemed like a living nightmare, the very embodiment of defiance. However, though Lady Miserian did not show it, such situations troubled her, stirred her, and likely even hurt her. How Emma wished that all of this would bypass her mistress, and that she could simply be happy. She deserved it, no matter what others said. That same day, after Alice had silenced the gossips, later in the evening, as Emma combed her mistress's thick hair, the maid suggested that she could have personally informed the Marquis about those heirs of the Count's families, so they would never dare to open their filthy mouths again. However, Lady Miserian firmly stated that Emma should not have been involved. This was a matter for her alone, her strength and authority, to prove that no one should disregard either her or her servants. When Emma asked in surprise why such efforts were necessary, given that they didn't even share noble blood, her mistress gave a faint smile and explained that people merely hid behind their hatred of her to insult her entire household and servants, assuming that everyone under one roof was the same. Alice could neither tolerate nor accept such behavior, and so she instructed Emma to also walk with her head held high and her shoulders squared. Once the Marquis's daughter became the Crown Prince's fiancée, she was subjected to rigorous lessons in palace etiquette and new responsibilities. At times, there wasn't even time to sleep, yet not a single palace visit was ever missed. After her returns, she often lacked the strength even to take a bath. Alice, utterly exhausted, would simply beg to be allowed to sleep. Even though there were countless rumors about the prince's hatred for his fiancée, she never displayed any emotion about it in front of Emma. Likewise, the maid, not wanting to accidentally wound her mistress's pride, neither offered comfort nor inquired about the truth of the rumors, even if she longed to support and console her. However, it seemed the loud rumors were true, for over time, her mistress's light gradually dimmed. One day, as Emma was shaking out the blankets, she happened to catch sight of her mistress, quite by chance, sitting on the ground in the shade, gazing at the river and crying. No one had ever seen her tears before, not even when people tried to drive her to despair by hurling cruel insults. The maid was stunned, but she hurried to her mistress, spreading out the blanket and draping it over her shoulders, lamenting the cold wind. When Emma urged her to stand, Alice posed a sudden question. Why is love so important? Why is it easier for the one who loves and smiles at the prince to become empress? Isn't the throne something to be earned, not simply a reward for loving and belonging to the highest ranks of nobility? It seemed the crown prince was oblivious to Lady Miserian's efforts, and now she was convinced that the notion she had been taught, that the primary duty of an empress was to help and support the emperor, was a lie. All her efforts had been in vain. Even if the prince had no feelings for her, he could at least have acknowledged her efforts, but he didn't deign to do even that. All the attention went to the one who only knew how to smile and be kind. Emma's heart was breaking. She desperately wished she could be a witch, conjure rain, and hide her mistress's bitter tears. She embraced her tightly, fervently apologizing for her powerlessness to help fulfill her mistress's wish. In her mind, she prayed ceaselessly to God for mercy and for Miserian's dream to come true, while her mistress kept convincing herself that it would be perfectly fine if she disappeared from this world forever. That day, both of their wishes came true, though not in a way anyone could have foreseen. From that day, many of her habits changed. When anxious, her mistress no longer tapped her ring finger on the table, nor did she drink a glass of water in the morning or bite her nails. Even her manner of speaking underwent a transformation. She developed a taste for spicy food, and even began treating her servants with more courtesy and respect. Emma, who had lived side by side with Lady Miserian, couldn't help but notice the new speech patterns, gait, and habits, and she realized this was not the same girl she had cared for all her life. One question kept echoing in her mind. Who was she? If the maid dared to show even the slightest doubt about her mistress's identity, she would surely be deemed insane and cast out of the palace. So she didn't dare to ask Alice directly, but she couldn't stop asking herself. Once, Emma tried to catch the imposter off guard by asking if she remembered a moment from her childhood, when at 6 years old, she first rode a racehorse, fell, and the prince helped her up. But the stranger knew that this had actually happened when Alice was 15, and she corrected the maid, passing Emma's test to rule out memory loss. The key events were all intact, only minor habits had changed. Lady Miserian then asked her not to bring up such trivial matters again, to which Emma obediently nodded. Yet the strangest and most surprising thing occurred during her attempts to seem like her usual old self. One night, the maid sat at a small desk, leaning over a book with a pencil in hand, scribbling various theories about what could have happened to her Alice. Perhaps her body had been possessed by an evil witch. Maybe she should seek help, but the moment she imagined her beloved mistress's body tied to a stake and engulfed in flames, Emma immediately dismissed the idea in horror. Her thoughts on what she ought to do were interrupted by a faint rustling sound. A shadow flickered past the window, and in the moonlight, it became clear. It was Alice. But where could she be headed so late at night? The journey could be dangerous in the dark, especially considering the recent troubles with the attack and the fall from the window. Could those incidents have been more than mere accidents? As soon as this thought crossed Emma's mind, she sprang to her feet in an instant. Grabbing the nearby lamp with a burning candle and along the edge of the dark forest, she ran as fast as she could after her mistress. Emma searched for the girl with her eyes, heading in the direction she had gone. She called out for Lady Miserian, but only the echo responded. She couldn't afford to lose her. Suddenly, branches rustled to her right, and when she turned toward the sound, she saw a familiar silhouette in a white dress. Calling out to her mistress once more, Emma let the candlestick fall from her hands and rushed toward her, shielding her face from the sharp branches. Alice stood with her back to her, but who could predict what would happen in the next moment? Emma kept running until the distance between them was no more than 3 meters. She tried to question Alice about her sudden flight and persuade her to return. With a distressed voice, she received the answer that Alice wanted to go home. The maid grabbed her mistress by the shoulders, gently shaking her, and suggested they return to the estate together. But Alice suddenly started talking about her mother. Emma thought she was delirious and wanted to remind her of something, but Alice kept insisting that she wanted the very same fried rice with kimchi her mother always made for her. Emma suddenly took a few steps back from the crying girl. It was a turning point in realizing that the Alice standing before her was undeniably not the confident, self-assured, sincere, and kind Lady Miserian the maid had known. Not at all. She was a broken soul, thrashing in her nightmare, unable to escape and return to her true path. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, and her voice broke from pleading to be let go to her real home, a place Emma knew nothing about, as she had come to fully grasp the situation far too late. When poor Alice began to spiral into hysteria, the maid immediately tried to calm her panic, gripping her cold, trembling hands in her own palms, and swearing that she would do everything in her power to help her mistress. She sincerely and firmly assured Alice that everything would be all right and that things would get better again, devotedly declaring that she would stay by her side until the very end. Only one question lingered unspoken on Emma's lips. Just how terrible had it been? How deeply had she sunk into despair that absolutely nothing in this world could keep her here? From that day, the servants kept a constant watch over their mistress, worried about her mental state and refusal to eat. They were ready to feed her with a spoon, offering her all her favorite treats, just to get her to eat something. Alice gave in to this. With her desire to rest and do nothing, such an initiative worked in her favor. Of course, after what had happened, rumors about her began to spread through the palace, and it was inevitable that they would reach beyond the gates of the imperial palace to the wider society. That day, jewelry merchants arrived at the Miserian estate, lavishly praising their jewels, trying to capture the attention of the lady, convincing her that anyone who saw her wearing a necklace would forget how to speak from the shock. The girl herself was indifferent, only noting in her mind that the people would never forget how to gossip about the slap from the crown prince to his fiancée. The only thing that caught her attention was the conversation of the maids, standing a little farther away, discussing the events. They were surprised that their mistress hadn't done anything. She could have complained to His Majesty or gone to Helen and caused a scene, which would have been much more like her. Alice wondered why she had gone to Entablem when it would have made more sense to go to the prince and, as it should be, smack him over the head with a club. Even if the desire for revenge had been there, suddenly, an image of the Marquis appeared in her mind, the same one who had placed his hand on her shoulder the previous day, and in haste, she ended the transaction, deciding to take everything and sending the merchants to collect payment on the lower floor. With her servants in tow, she left the main hall, lost in her thoughts. Why, after dinner with the Marquis, had she been thinking more about her family? Perhaps even because of such a small detail like the identical size of their palms with her real father. The girl couldn't describe her relationship with her parents as either good or bad. It was just ordinary if you didn't take into account how tired she had become of her family home. The same cheap food, the same small store with the same cashier, the same reproaches from her parents about the lack of money, crushing all dreams and motivation, forcing her to rely only on herself. The pressure of being constantly asked about something and expected to do well, with no interest or support for her endeavors, studies or work, was suffocating and hurtful. When she returned home, the only questions she faced were whether she had arrived, whether she had eaten, and that was it, while her younger brother could ask for his favorite dish at any time, even though the ingredients weren't in the house, and her father always supported him, despite the financial strain, because he had an upcoming exam retake, which he was allowed to try, unlike his daughter. Such condescension toward her brother sparked a growing resentment toward her parents. Even when she moved out and they called, the conversations were mostly on holidays and birthdays, when the daughter would send them money. Though they offered her to visit, cook her favorite chicken stew, and her mother would say that her father missed her even if he didn't show it, the girl would brush it off with the excuse of too much work and studying. In truth, their expectation for her return didn't feel real at all. Her mother even seemed to have forgotten that she loved her daughter. When asked what she wanted for her birthday, the girl, without a second thought, quickly replied, "Nothing." This cold attitude towards them was driven by the understanding that she could meet with them whenever she wanted, as they were always waiting for her. Now memories surfaced of how her little brother was always sweet and helped around the house, which was in stark contrast to her sister. If only there had been a chance to meet them soon, the girl would have definitely tried to be a little warmer. The morning began with Emma speaking about the readiness of the attire for the knight's investiture, urging her lady to head to the palace as soon as possible. Her only concern was the color of the dress, while Alice recalled that in the novel this event was quite significant, and that it was unbecoming for the prince's fiancée to miss it, even if she didn't want to be there at all. Therefore, the girl hurriedly prepared and got into the carriage, realizing that the prince didn't feel the slightest regret for what he had done. He hadn't faced any consequences for the slap, so now she felt like a cow being taken to slaughter. The carriage moved, leaving the estate behind, and Lady Miserian gazed out the window, lost in thought. The beautiful blue sky with small clouds, more like feathers, the streets filled with happy, smiling people. And there was only Alice, sadly looking at the crowd, wondering why she had to endure it all. For what? What went wrong in her life that she had to force a smile for the fool who left a burning mark on her cheek? The firm command to stop the carriage came faster than she could weigh the decision. When the guards questioned what was wrong, Alice repeated the order louder and more forcefully, demanding the carriage to halt immediately. With a screech and an exclamation, the horse suddenly stopped, and Lady Miserian wasted no time, flinging open the door and running out, ignoring the guard accompanying her. She ran with all her might in uncomfortable high-heeled shoes, panicking, turning around to check if she had escaped the knights. A dark, empty alley appeared before her, into which Alice darted, hoping to hide there forever. She prayed that the world would abandon her for trying to escape her fated destiny, that it would return her to her home, so that it would finally give up and acknowledge that in this story, only Helena mattered. However, her fervent pleas were interrupted by a shout, signaling that they had found her, with an order to capture the lady. The girl refused to surrender and, quickly slipping off her uncomfortable shoes, ran barefoot, desperate not to be caught and taken back to the palace against her will. Narrow alleyways between tall buildings, casting shadows, hid the running girl, who in a panic searched for a place to hide, until a sudden foreign hand reached out to her, grabbing the wrist of the frightened Alice. However, the person who caught her was a little girl with short hair, who pressed her finger to her lips, signaling that she wouldn't turn the stranger in. Suddenly, as if reading the girl's thoughts, she asked if she wanted to escape from her pursuers, to hide. There was no time to think, and the lady nodded, to which the little girl grinned mischievously. She pressed 2 fingers to her lips and whistled loudly, calling a swarm of children who filled the street, blocking the guard's way. Citing that her friends would buy time for the fugitive, she grabbed her hand and quickly led her away. They stopped in some house, hurriedly slamming the door shut, and the barefoot girl finally managed to catch her breath, along with her rescuer. The little girl extended her hand, but not for an introduction, for payment for her rescue and the call for help. Alice, realizing that she truly owed the girl a thank you, was about to search her pockets for coins, but of course there were none in her dress. When the girl realized there would be no money, she visibly drooped. And noticing this, the girl began to take off her earrings. Without hesitation or regret, she handed them to the little one as thanks, and the girl's eyes immediately lit up. The moment she took the jewel in her hands, there was a loud banging on the door. Alice was stunned at how quickly they had been found, but before she could even fully panic, her rescuer was already pushing her toward the wardrobe. Silent, she instructed her not to make a sound, then closed the wardrobe door, where Lady Miserian was already hiding. Judging by the way the girl spoke to the guest, he wasn't a knight, and the girl dared to peek through a crack. She guessed it was the girl's brother, and he didn't stand out in any way, just a typical background character. However, suddenly, it was as though he tensed up and asked who was there. The girl, completely unable to lie, stammered that she would never bring anyone into such a dusty house, to which the young man sighed in disappointment, and turning toward the wardrobe, he walked straight toward it. Alice covered her mouth with her hands, trying not to breathe or make a sound, silently praying he would pass by, and the girl sharply told her brother to stop. But the door was already opening, and a blond young man with brown eyes was looking at her, while the hidden Miserian trembled slightly, not understanding what would happen next. The young man calmly asked the guest to step out, to which Alice reluctantly stood up, leaving her failed hiding spot, and meeting the gaze of the one who had found her with determination. He turned a questioning look to his sister, who flinched and extended his hand, palm up, which the girl stared at as if she didn't understand what he wanted. But as soon as he made his expression slightly sterner, the little girl gave in, opening her fists, and she extended the contents of her palm to her brother. It turned out to be her earrings, which he returned despite the girl's objections, and Alice supported her side, confirming that they were payment for the rescue. The young man turned away, making it clear that he knew the jewels weren't stolen, but still stepped away from the bewildered lady. He approached his sister, ruffled her unruly hair, and reminded her that she shouldn't get involved with the nobility, even for special reasons, nor accept such expensive gifts from them. The girl once again looked at the jewelry in her palm, and suddenly threw it toward the young man, who by some miracle managed to catch the earrings right in front of his face. At the questioning look from Miserian, the girl sternly warned that if they didn't accept her payment, there would be far more trouble than it seemed right now. For the payment was not only for rescuing the nobility, but also for keeping quiet and not spreading rumors about what had happened among society. Even if the slight risk of these commoners discovering Alice's identity could be dismissed, a warning to stay silent about the girl aiding a noblewoman in escaping the guards and hiding was essential. Under such a condition, this fortunate encounter might become a fateful opportunity, as there was a chance they could help find the priest Metius, whom Iason had mentioned. With this possibility in mind, Lady Miserian expressed a desire to learn about a reliable guild of informants. The girl immediately signaled her willingness to share what she knew, but her brother stepped in front of her, blocking the way and telling her to remain silent, casting a distrustful glance at their guest. Alice was keenly aware of how dangerous and unwise it was for commoners to interact with the nobility, so she wasn't surprised by the young man's mixed reaction as he hastily tried to defuse the situation, apologizing for the thoughtless child who had caused inconvenience, and declared that they had neither the strength, the power, nor the knowledge to assist a noblewoman. He then firmly asked her to leave their home, bowing his head slightly as a gesture of respect. Lady Miserian noted his eloquence and politeness, assuming that they concealed a measure of wisdom, which greatly impressed her. Without moving a step closer to the exit, Alice warned that if she were to cross the threshold, everyone would assume she had been abducted by them, and such suspicions would endanger not only the household, but also all the children who had blocked the alley during her escape with the girl. Sitting herself down on the bed, she threatened that they would all face questioning, and asked pointedly if they were certain she should leave the house. To sway her new acquaintances toward a different decision, she offered them a guarantee they would remain safe, as the lady would confirm that they had in fact saved her. Giving them the right to choose, the young girl lightly tugged at her brother's sleeve, adding what seemed to be the final nudge for him to relent to their guest. Respecting the young man's decision, Alice reiterated her demands that they tell her about a guild of informants capable of keeping secrets and that they keep silent themselves. The little girl spoke of an honest man, Father Senshi, whom they could trust, and who lived at the end of the street. Lady Miserian nodded and asked them to pass along a request to him to gather information about the priest Matthias and his current whereabouts. When asked about payment, Alice expressed doubts about the reliability of this man and whether he could truly guarantee finding the information. However, the girl firmly insisted that he could be trusted, though her brother, with a pensive and dissatisfied expression, averted his gaze, something Alice did not fail to notice. Deciding not to beat around the bush, the young man immediately asked the question that had been troubling him since her arrival. Had she chosen them on purpose? The girl quipped sarcastically, saying she had been waiting every second to meet commoners whose existence she hadn't even known about, before more seriously reiterating the matter of pursuit. However, her explanation did little to dispel his suspicions toward a noblewoman giving orders to complete strangers to find someone. Even her attempt to buy their silence with earrings couldn't eliminate the fact that secrets could become exposed at any moment. Lady Miserian seemed to have an epiphany, raising her eyebrows sharply and suddenly stepping closer to her conversational partner. She voiced the thoughts of the young man, whose expression remained unchanged about his growing distrust of their guest. But even after her sharp deduction, he didn't so much as raise an eyebrow, despite Alice's face being uncomfortably close to his, which forced her to press harder with a threat. If she willed it, they could be killed within 6 hours. But would fear truly grip a person if threatened by a mere rat? Wouldn't it be easier for him to simply dispose of her and use his reputation to convince others that everything she said was slander? Alice was certain the young man wasn't foolish and had already understood everything without her arguments, as it was no coincidence he had worked so hard to shield the child from her. The little girl continued to look at the stranger, but now with fear, clutching her brother's hand tightly, seeking protection in him. Seeing her savior's distress, Alice gave a friendly smile and tousled the girl's unruly hair, reassuring her that no one would get hurt as long as they kept everything that had happened, and the small request, a secret. The young man, expressionless, quietly reproached the noblewoman, saying she didn't even consider them human. Without attempting to justify herself, Alice simply shrugged, admitting only that she was somewhat different from the typical noble. After all, as a reader, she truly didn't see them as people, merely as characters in a novel, nothing more, nothing less. The real people who truly mattered to her existed only in the original world. Family, friends, music, all of it was worth enduring death over and over again. With the ordinary counterfeits from the book, she neither had the strength nor the desire to bother with formalities. Everyone was merely a tool for breaking free from the chains of this world, and now she used them as she saw fit. She ordered them to escort her back. The young man regarded her with a cold gaze, including her completely bare feet visible beneath the lifted hem of her voluminous dress. Without much thought, he bent down, pulling his boots off his feet before the bewildered girl, who silently watched until he placed his footwear directly in front of Alice. The lady guessed he didn't have another pair of shoes and wondered what he would do if she took his only boots, but he simply shrugged, saying he wouldn't allow a lady to walk around barefoot. Carefully helping her slip the boots onto her feet, he was the first to head toward the door, asking her to come out when she was ready, and stepped over the threshold, leaving Alice momentarily lost in thought. In truth, she didn't really want to go. However, even if she stayed, they would surely find her, and not even a day would pass. Besides, she had set herself the goal of returning to her own world, and time was still ticking. After having faced death multiple times in her attempts to leave this story, this meeting with the prince, and yet another slap, were absolutely nothing. The reader found it more fitting and practical to simply kill off the fiancé. but she wondered how the world would react to such a violation of cause and effect laws, like the death of the male protagonist, and the girl was insanely curious to find out, to see it with her own eyes. She was sure it was worth trying and waiting for the consequences. Standing before her servants and guards, who were bombarding her with questions, Lady Miserian firmly stated that she had simply wanted to take a walk alone because of the stuffiness in the carriage. When accused of running away from her guard, Alice dismissed it, explaining that she had returned safe and sound, so it had done no harm. Citing fatigue, the young woman climbed the stairs to her room, while Emma prepared a bath. Relaxing in the hot water with rose petals, Alice was thinking through her next steps, meeting with Hybris, searching for clues about herself and this world in general. Her mind wandered to their recent and rather uncomfortable encounter near the pastry shop, and after her vehement denials and justifications, admitting her true nature would be quite strange. On the other hand, she could shift the blame onto the large number of people around them and the risk of being overheard. As the high priest, he was supposed to help the poor, innocent young woman with her suffering. The chance to gain an ally was worth the effort of showing up at the palace. The carriage approached the imperial palace, and guards stood around it, seemingly assigned to make sure Lady Miserian wouldn't escape again. The butler informed her that His Majesty was absent today, and only the crown prince would be present, and Alice expressed her regret at the emperor's absence, though in reality she was relieved by yesterday's escape. The hem of the purple, shimmering dress on the floor reflected the sunlight streaming through the windows into the room where the outfit was being fitted on Lady Miserian. The imperial court seamstress highlighted the beauty of the prince's bride, claiming that everyone would envy her, but upon not seeing admiration on the client's face, she became concerned whether everything was to her liking. However, Lady Miserian assured her that everything was fine, though she pointed out that the long edges would make it difficult for the servants to clean. But was she really worried about that? The seamstress explained that the dress would be sent to the estate later that evening, so there was no need for concern. Lady Miserian asked for help to change back, as she wanted to walk around the palace, but she didn't mention that this was necessary for her search for Hybris. The young woman slowly descended the stairs in her heeled shoes, suffering from the pain caused by yesterday's barefoot runs. With a heavy sigh, she filled her mind with another task, to find a way to meet with the high priest in this vast imperial palace. How unfortunate that he didn't appear at the most needed and unnecessary moments, like Helena and the prince. Hybris appeared right before her, surprising the girl to whom luck had suddenly turned. Alice rushed after him, asking him to stop, but it seemed he didn't hear her and was steadfastly heading toward the temple, which she would no longer be able to enter, and the next opportunity to meet would likely not come anytime soon. As soon as she quickened her pace to catch up, the toe of her shoe hit a stone, causing Alice to stumble forward, and she fell flat on the path. It seemed the only way to get Hybris's attention was like this, for he finally turned around, studying his pursuer who was holding her ankle. He politely asked if everything was all right, but the young woman irritably told him to assess the situation himself. Then they silently locked eyes, and Lady Miserian was noticeably irritated. Of course, she was the villain. No one would even look at her, unlike Helena, to whom everyone naturally gravitated. The high priest apologized, leaning toward her, and placed his hand on her sprained ankle. For a few seconds, it glowed with a divine light from holy powers. After this miracle, the high priest declared that her leg would be fine now. He stood up, preparing to leave Alice, but she immediately grabbed his clothes, asking if they had met before. In response to Hybris's suspicious nod, she reminded him that he had asked who she was, and the young man turned to her with interest, removing her hand from the fabric and gently taking it into his palm, helping the lady rise. He stared at her intently, not blinking, as if peering into her very core, beyond her shell. The young woman jerked her hand away, looking around to avoid the prying eyes and ears of others, then seriously asked him how he saw her. The young man shook his head and explained that he couldn't make out the shape of her soul, only its unusual color, the one that, in this world, only she had, and no one else. Despite all his hopes that it was just a mistake, her questions confirmed the truth of his thoughts. The reader began to justify herself, explaining that she couldn't reveal it earlier due to the inconvenient situation, as well as the surrounding circumstances. After all, not every day do you encounter someone who has come from another world, something the high priest had already suspected. The foreigner immediately asked the main question, whether there was a way to return to her world, and requested a clear answer as Hybris began to contemplate. He hesitated, and the young woman suspected that, like her, he was in the dark. Indeed, He began to ponder doubtfully, as if recalling something. She impatiently urged him to hurry. In a quiet and regretful voice, he said that, to the best of his knowledge, there had never been an outsider who made it out alive until today. In Alice's mind, it felt as if there was emptiness, like white noise, and at the same time, a flood of thoughts. A strange sensation arose, for until that moment, everything had seemed like a strange coincidence, not frightening in the slightest. And now she nervously chuckled, casting a vacant glance at the ground, while the high priest watched her beginning hysteria with regret. Desperately, the foreigner pleaded with a trembling voice for Eris to think. There must be some way out, perhaps a door between dimensions. Despite the man's attempts to interrupt her efforts to grasp at the faintest possible clue, to hold on to even a shred of hope, she continued to convince both herself and him that she couldn't have ended up here if there was no way out, because if there were no exit, there shouldn't be an entrance either. If he didn't know anything, it didn't mean she should be convinced that everything was lost. She didn't listen to the young man, she only pleaded with him as the high priest to search for historical records in the archives as soon as he was in the temple and to help her. But he, wanting to finally interrupt her monologue, grabbed her by the shoulders and raised his voice, ordering her to listen. When she fell silent, he spoke more quietly and calmly, telling her that since she wasn't from this world, her original self had completely vanished from it. The foreigner had only been able to come here due to the existence of a body with a dead soul, according to the laws of all living things. To put it more clearly, if she wished to return to her own world, she could only do so with the death of the soul in her current body. However, since she was not there but here, in her homeland, she was an utterly empty shell. Alice desperately whispered that this was impossible, but Eris confidently stated that it was true. Since there was no soul in her body that could die, returning was impossible for her. All that was left for the foreigner was to accept it and live the life of the one she had to replace here. Judging by Alice's expression, she couldn't accept someone else's life. Her brows furrowed, and her piercing, irritated gaze seemed to drill through Eris. Did he say this knowing what Lady Miserian's life was like, if it could even be called a life? How many attempts to destroy herself would she have to make in order to escape and end this nightmare? After all, it had to happen, right? Her body shuddered at the painful memories of previous attempts. Was it possible that a natural death, or one aided by someone, would come to her faster than her own hands could bring it about? Since there were no other options but to accept someone else's life, the foreigner would rather escape with the witch to somewhere far away from her fiancé. So, she firmly and confidently told the high priest that she didn't want to. He was horrified, asking the girl again, and she insisted that even if what he said about the rules and laws of life was true, she would break them all to return, even at the cost of her own life. The young man, in despair, reached out toward the departing foreigner, wanting to convince her that it would be wiser to value the life given by the gods. And his words made the girl stop and turn around, to say that she was born to her parents, not a deity, just like him, with the exception of the possibility that he came from the Holy Spirit. Wishing God's blessing to the young man, who found nothing to say, she left, not caring that he might think she was criticizing the temple. Since she wasn't part of this world, she couldn't be accused of apostasy. Eris, the one she had read about in the book, definitely wouldn't have acted this way. All hope of meeting the high priest faded. The expected help was not received, and in fact, she was left in even greater despair than before. The events had already made Lady Miserian's head throb. Alice walked toward the palace gates, but a very familiar figure stood before her. Helen stood in front of her, nervously clenching her fists against her chest, locking eyes with her weary rival. She diverted her gaze and rubbed her shoulders, not daring to speak to Lady Miserian, so Alice decided not to waste time waiting for a single word from her, silently walking around Helen. But Helen found the strength to stop Alice, grabbing her hand and asking her to listen. Lady Miserian turned around irritably, asking what was going on, and in response, with a slight pause, she received an apology from the distressed girl. To the logical question of what for, she mentioned the slap from the Crown Prince. Alice exhaled irritably, reminding her that the slap wasn't from Helen, but from Alecto, and that there was nothing to apologize for, and that the feeling of guilt shouldn't be there, so she insisted that she could leave. But Enteblim also held her hand tightly, forcing her to turn around again, and with sadness, suggested that Alice not accept her apology. Even though she didn't lay a hand on the princess herself, she had supported His Highness's actions. Lady Miserian listened silently to Enteblim's remorse that she should have stopped his hand before the slap, saved her from the blow, explained the situation that the maid had miscommunicated to the Crown Prince. Instead of just watching until Alice's departure, the guilt weighed on her shoulders, and it gnawed at her soul, and that's why she was begging Alice for forgiveness. The girl froze in surprise. She hadn't expected such straightforward and sincere apologies from Helen. Her image became even more endearing during those heartfelt words. It would have been so much easier to hate her without tormenting herself if she were a sinister wolf in the skin of a cute and fluffy lamb. Alice lowered her gaze to Helen's hands, still clutching her palm, and suddenly asked the question, how does she manage to be so beautiful and pure? After all, her initial role was to be a mere palace maid, yet her untouched hands were softer and more delicate than those of many noble ladies. Helen was taken aback by such a sudden shift in the conversation, though the reader knew well that she had no time for laundry, cleaning, or cooking, thanks to the love of everyone around her. Alecto, Jason, the Empress, all of them called her for talks, always smiling at her. She reminded Alice of a girl from her own world, a classmate. The girl was surrounded by many friends thanks to her beauty and kindness. In fact, Alice herself sympathized with her, but they never became friends. The classmate often mocked Alice's relationship with her parents, how they couldn't help her. Even when Alice confessed that her family wasn't in the best financial situation, the girl was still certain that since she was their daughter, she could ask them for whatever she wanted, whenever she desired. Even with her kindness, she didn't know about hardships and couldn't accept them, not realizing that her ignorance was a huge privilege. Perhaps that's why she remained so innocent and naive. Finally, Alice spoke. However, she let out a cold admission of hatred toward people like Helen. She pulled her hand from the other's grip, thinking that even now, someone was working twice as hard as her conversation partner. But that couldn't be called the reason for hatred. No. More wisely, she decided to convince Helen not to apologize to her, as it wouldn't make her view her any differently. After entering a new world and becoming an esteemed person here, the foreigner was convinced that she had a terrible character, but she also didn't forbid Helen from hating her if she was capable of such feelings at all. The next morning at the estate, in Lady Miserian's bedroom, the maids struggled to tighten her corset for the new dress, prompting Alice to consider persuading everyone to abandon these torturous practices. After all, she was already slender enough. A short time later, she was fully adorned and dressed in a stunning, shimmering purple gown with elegant white silk sleeves draped off her shoulders and long gloves perfectly matching the dress. Alice was, without a doubt, breathtaking. She walked straight to the royal carriage, which would take her directly to the investiture where the Marquis had advised Alice to find herself a reliable knight, someone who could handle tasks no one should know about, who would never speak a word of secret dealings, someone willing to die for her. However, the reader had already resolved to end her own life and had no desire to place anyone else in harm's way due to her selfish intentions or inability to properly protect her. Depriving anyone of the honor of serving a beautiful lady was not part of her plans, so she intended to make a quick survey and return to the estate. Soon, she politely inclined her head before the prince, whose demeanor made it abundantly clear that he had been forced to attend. It was obvious that he wasn't meeting his bride of his own volition, but likely under orders from the emperor. Whispers filled the air around them, commenting on how stunning Lady Miserian was, her beauty undeniably fit for the next empress. But none of them knew that her thoughts were filled only with disdain and an unwillingness to take the hand of her dim-witted fiancé. Despite her inner contempt, she extended her hand, waiting for Alecto to act. The prince simply scowled angrily, raising a questioning brow in bewilderment, provoking Lady Miserian's irritation and prompting her to mock his inaction. Was he planning to keep standing there forever? Their cold gazes locked, and with a rough motion the prince seized her hand, all but dragging her along behind him. Realizing that Alecto was deliberately behaving this way, she suddenly stopped in her tracks, forcing her fiancé to turn and look at her. She cast a displeased glare at the arrogant face of the blonde and began accusing him of his rudeness and unwillingness to even hold her hand. But before she could continue, he suddenly swept her into his arms in front of everyone, silencing her mid-sentence. She demanded to know what Alecto thought he was doing, to which he gave a sarcastic reply, claiming she had clearly hinted at wanting an embrace from her dear fiancé. Firmly denying his claim, she insisted he put her down immediately, but he refused, citing her status as the bride of the palace, even when she threatened to start kicking. It turned out that, for some merit of hers, the emperor had ordered his son to treat Lady Miserian with exceptional care. Judging by the prince's reaction, he was blaming her for this situation as well. adding to his general mistrust. Alecto resumed his accusations, though it seemed his father had already reprimanded him, leaving the choice of tactful silence open. But such treatment was hardly something Alice could simply overlook. She clutched her fingers tightly around Alecto's neck, forcing him to drop her in a sudden, graceless movement. Immediately, Alice feigned concern, expressing mock pity for His Highness, lamenting how terribly he must have been struggling to carry her. The onlookers began whispering in surprise, remarking that the prince didn't seem to be in his best shape today if he couldn't manage to carry the lightest and most delicate lady in the empire. This caused Alecto visible embarrassment, but Alice wasn't done yet. She fanned the flames by loudly commanding the servants to fetch a sunshade for His Highness to prevent him from fainting in his weakened state. Almost instantly, a servant rushed forward with a parasol, and Lady Miserian continued her exaggerated display of worry. Theatrically, Lady Miserian took her fiancé by the arm, reminding him to smile, as the Emperor had ordered him to take good care of her. The prince, in turn, reminded her of the boundaries long crossed thanks to the Emperor's affection for her. Alice suggested he submit a petition, attempt to annul his marriage with such a cruel and harmful woman, and flee to the sweet and gentle Entobloom, unless of course his plan was to force his fiancée to kneel beside him and beg for it. Her words left the young man stunned. After all, he could not utter a single word in his father's presence, and thus vented all his anger on her. Their quarrel was interrupted by a maid holding an umbrella, who reminded them of the upcoming knighting ceremony. Lady Miserian, under the pretense of not wanting to be late, dragged Alecto along with her. Angrily, he reminded her that the Emperor's favor toward her would not last forever, and she was rapidly draining the last drops of his goodwill. Alice, with a smirk, retorted, asking whether he had any goodwill at all, as she herself had long run out of it. Sunlight streamed through the palace windows, where the crowd had already gathered, strolling about and admiring the knights. The opening ceremony had only just concluded, but Lady Miserian already felt nauseated. She rose from her seat, deciding to leave. She opted to circle around the palace, trying to ease the tormenting sensation from the corset, squeezing her organs and rearranging everything inside her before her meeting with the imperial family. She hoped to find a quiet spot to rest, but suddenly heard a commotion nearby, in the bushes behind the trees. Someone was chattering and hitting something. Alice headed in that direction to investigate what was going on. A group of young men was violently beating and kicking something, or, more precisely, someone, underneath a white tablecloth. They called him a weakling and an idiot, provoking him and demanding that he stand. From their conversation, it seemed they had decided to put the illegitimate child in his place, a boy who, apparently, aspired to become a knight. After all, in this world, there were only two ways to achieve any status: become either a knight or a magical engineer. In the novel Alice had read, Helena also escaped false accusations and married the crown prince only after regaining her aristocratic status. Alice's attention shifted back to the beaten boy. Judging by the fabric on him, likely chosen to avoid leaving marks and arousing suspicion, the bullying had been going on for quite some time. Even if she showed mercy and helped the poor boy, it wouldn't save him. In fact, it might make things worse by emboldening the bullies to commit even crueler acts. And even if there was a solution, she didn't feel particularly inclined to deal with it. Suddenly, the leader of the group ordered the boy to be lifted. They grabbed him by the collar of his uniform and yanked away the fabric, and at the sight before her, Alice's green eyes widened. The battered boy turned out to be the brother of the little girl who had saved her from pursuit a few days ago. Suddenly, his eyes darted toward her, and judging by his expression, he recognized her. Now the question of whether a noblewoman should intervene to help this particular illegitimate child became far more pressing. She nervously fidgeted with her dress, weighing whether her interference was justified. Would it be seen as cheap pity from an aristocrat, or worse, condescension? After all, just 2 days ago, she had threatened that, by her will, they would be gone within 6 hours, and any words they spoke would be dismissed as baseless rumors. It would look highly suspicious if the woman who had blackmailed him suddenly emerged from the shadows to rescue him from torment. It would be the most blatant of deceptions. Sometimes doing an unwanted good deed could result in greater harm. In this case, it would only embarrass him further. The boy didn't take his light-colored eyes off her, silently waiting for her next move, but she turned away, justifying her decision by reminding herself that her agreement had been with the little girl, not her brother. She glanced back at him one last time over her shoulder as he watched the departing lady with his eyes. She returned to the palace once again, and at the ongoing knighting ceremony, rows of young men in uniform stood in perfect alignment, ready to serve their masters. This tradition was an excellent opportunity for aristocrats seeking to elevate their status. They only needed to recruit knights from the highest nobility. Many guests had already made arrangements with knights beforehand and were anxious, fearing their choices might be claimed earlier in the selection order. Since Lady Miserian had no intention of hiring a knight, she repeatedly passed on her turn, but her attention was drawn to the distant row. For the most part, it was filled with older men compared to the young men standing at the front. A guard leaned toward her and explained that those were the ones who hadn't been chosen previously. Alice inquired about what happened to them if they remained unchosen, and the man elaborated. Initially, the aristocrats assume it's just bad luck, but as time goes on, guests begin to suspect there's a reason for it and avoid choosing them altogether. The older they get, the weaker they're perceived to be, and if they remain unselected for 10 years, they give up and become mercenaries. Among the older men stood out the battered boy she had encountered earlier outside the palace. Lady Miserian asked if there was any demand for mercenaries, and the reply was that people preferred clean and well-groomed knights. Even serving a poor family would pay better than being a mercenary. Moreover, knights had the right to marry their master's daughter to improve their status or strike a deal with a noble family. However, such a future would be a tremendous shock for an aristocrat, as losing their sense of dignity was considered far worse than death itself. The guard standing behind hesitated, but then admitted that the last time he dared to speak of his dreams, he was immediately accused of impropriety. Lady Miserian simply told him not to dwell on the past, to which the man let out a relieved sigh and bowed in gratitude for her graciousness. But then he brought up a topic she had already heard endlessly. Setting aside any possible reasons to fear this decision, he fervently urged her to choose and hire her own knight. Alice shifted her gaze to the guard, who knelt before her on one knee, saying that her choice could save the life of the one she selected. After all, she could release him from her service at any time if she wished, and it would already be easier for him to be chosen again or find another job. At her raised eyebrow of skepticism, he added that their entire lives had been devoted to training to become knights. It would be a great tragedy if their fire extinguished without ever having the chance to blaze brightly. When Lady Miserian remarked that his words sounded like a plea for mercy, the guard did not deny it, and instead asked her to listen. She truly began to consider it. Though becoming a savior might bolster her status, it would also place an additional burden of responsibility on her shoulders, a far cry from taming a small animal. But she made her decision. Alice raised her hand and pointed her finger at the battered boy in the second-to-last row, declaring that she wanted to take him into her service. The lady's piercing gaze bore into the stunned young man, who froze for a moment, staring back at her in astonishment. However, within a few seconds, he bent his knee before her as a servant brought the sword for the ritual. Lady Miserian asked about his loyalty and devotion to her, demanding an oath before the face of God, much like in the knighthood initiation ceremony, and the boy obediently swore that he would follow her, even if the road ahead were filled with poverty and hardship. He raised his head and spoke the final words, gazing directly into her eyes that no temptations would sway him from his true path. The girl gave a faint nod, her expression unchanged, and touched the blade of the sword to his shoulder, contemplating that this didn't feel like saving him. She was sure that in a few years, he would surely have the chance for a better life. Yet after what had transpired, this was a debt repaid to the boy for a small and insignificant kindness that the ordinary nobility would have ignored. His own boots for her when she had no shoes. But now she had repaid him in full. Alice asked for his name, but the new knight, lowering his eyes in shame, confessed that he had no name. Lady Miserian pondered, trying to come up with something. Studying her new knight and placing her hand on his head and lifting it slightly, decided that he would be called Anakin. Looking into his eyes, she remembered a moment from a novel she had read. Lady Miserian, despised by all, had one person who stood by her until the very end, her own Black Knight, who now stood before the reader. The Crown Prince's fiancée could not leave such an important event without bidding farewell to the imperial family. Despite her overwhelming desire to leave the knighting ceremony and return home, she approached the Emperor and Empress, greeting them respectfully, and it seemed that only Alec's father was genuinely pleased to see Alice. He complimented her appearance, especially her purple dress, to which the girl thanked the palace for the beautiful attire. The Emperor noted that, contrary to her earlier decision not to hire a knight, she had changed her mind, and Alice explained that everyone had strongly urged her to do so, and she had no reason to oppose them. The emperor approved of her choice, though his wife and son were less pleased with her presence. Lady Miserian glanced at her fiancé, hinting that he should speak up about wanting to break off the marriage arrangement, but he merely turned away, bringing a glass of red wine to his lips, ignoring her. Forcing herself not to roll her eyes, Alice bowed and asked for permission to leave the event due to the pain in her body and exhaustion from having woken up at dawn, receiving immediate approval from the emperor. Thanking him for his concern, Miserian exited the palace, deciding that the first thing she would do upon sitting in the carriage was take off her shoes before her feet completely gave out. Suddenly she heard a familiar voice. In the gazebo stood Iason, who was passionately asking Helena for something. A scene flashed in the reader's mind. In this chapter, the knighthood ceremony played almost no role compared to what happened after it. Iason's oath of loyalty to Helena in order to become her knight. Helena naively reminded Kajaru that such an oath could only be given once, and asked why he wanted to offer it to her specifically, not realizing that her words were the answer. The boy drew his sword, kneeling and bowing his head, and recited the oath that Alice herself had recently received. He offered her the blade to complete the ritual with the final words of his readiness to follow her, even along a path of poverty and hardship. Entablam grew anxious, but Iason firmly insisted that he wanted to protect her until the end, begging her to allow him to do so. The strong dragon slayer held the sword before the delicate girl, ready to become her knight, and a small hand gently stroked the boy's red hair. An ideal love scene would have unfolded before Alice, if she hadn't known about the prince observing the picture, who was visibly tense, unable to believe that his best friend had sworn an oath of loyalty to his beloved. No friend would dare such a thing for an ordinary childhood companion, unless of course he preferred a ring to a sword, but naturally Helen didn't understand this, and the young woman decided to step in. She stepped into the gazebo, drawing the couple's attention, and apologized to Mr. Kajar in case she had interrupted them. At her polite question about whether she had interrupted anything, Jason hesitantly replied that nothing had happened. Lady Miserian turned to Helen, saying that the Empress had been looking for her, which made Helen panic, and after thanking Alice and hastily saying goodbye to Kajar, she rushed out of the gazebo, heading towards the palace. The prince followed her, replacing the dull love triangle scene depicted in the book. Now Lady Miserian was left alone with Sir Kajar, and turned to him, drawing his attention. She gave him a small piece of advice, suggesting that he should at least look around from time to time, but he stupidly smiled, asking what she meant. Suddenly, a memory flashed through Alice's mind. He was a master of the sword, which meant he was aware of both her and Alecto's presence. The knight's expression grew more serious. He couldn't help but notice the foreign energy, yet he still proceeded with his intentions. Jason adjusted a strand of the woman's hair, saying that she was making a surprised face. Irritated, the girl swatted his hand away from her hair, and the young man calmly continued, reminding her of his request not to be upset with them, but noting that she hadn't fully understood his words. This wasn't friendly advice, it was a warning, and now Mr. Kajar spoke of it directly. It seemed he believed that Alice had been slapped for tormenting Helen, and if we recall the original book, it was justified. She had always taunted her rival, so he could very well hate Lady Miserian. Perhaps, if he had killed her earlier, everyone would have been much happier, and dragging it out was becoming tedious. That was why the girl suggested Jason finish it right now, since he held a sword in his hands. For a swordmaster, it would be no trouble to slice her apart. The young man was taken aback, and Lady Miserian quickly moved toward him, then suddenly reached for the blade, which at that moment clinked against the stone floor of the gazebo. Now he held her firmly by the wrists, not allowing her to move them, and Alice whispered that if he made such warnings, he should also be ready to kill an opponent. His eyes pierced through her, and the question that had recently been voiced by Hybris escaped his lips. Who the hell is she? Alice walked past him, asking again what sudden foolishness he had just said. After all, he had never cared about Lady Miserian. The carriage with Alice and her new knight pulled away from the palace, and the girl pondered that she knew no more about the Black Knight than Jason knew about her. In the novel, his name was never revealed, perhaps because he always stayed in the shadows. There was no mention of his appearance either. The only thing known for sure was that he was Alice's only companion, and the one who could love her. However, in this world, he had met a reader, not a real character from the story, so perhaps he wouldn't fall in love if it wasn't her. Then there was the possibility of betrayal that couldn't be ignored. All these thoughts made her head ache when Anakin suddenly asked a question. Why had she chosen him? Lady Miserian asked if he preferred another master, to which he replied that he had no right to choose. Unlike her, the daughter of the Marquis Miserian and fiancée of the prince, who couldn't choose an illegitimate, nameless boy from a sea of knights from noble families without some ulterior motive. The girl looked at Anakin, unable to imagine how he could fall in love with Alice. She waved her hand, saying that he could forget all the nonsense the knights of her family had filled his head with during her absence. She had no doubt they had spun tales about kindness and salvation, but that wasn't the truth. Her reason lay in the Marquess's words about how her knight would do what must be kept secret, silence about all her secrets. And most importantly, as Alice had stated, he would have to die for her. Anakin looked at his mistress, seemingly realizing what she had just said. While he helped his lady out of the carriage, the girl thought that, since she knew her knight's weakness, he wouldn't resist her, and the guarantee that she wouldn't lose control over him was what made her choose him as her champion. Once in her chambers, the lady finally stretched her legs out on the bed after a long day, but her attention was drawn to the small mirror by her pillow, in which, instead of her reflection, she saw familiar sapphire eyes and red hair. Startled, she screamed and jumped out of bed, and at her cry a maid rushed in, asking what had happened. Her mistress quickly came up with an explanation, saying a bug must have flown into the room, and dismissed Emma, assuring her there was nothing to worry about. As soon as the door slammed shut, Alice muttered venomously, wondering why she had been frightened like that, to which the witch retorted sarcastically about how busy she was. The stranger had completely forgotten her request to carry the mirror with her. Getting to the point and asking for the news, Medea conveyed the words from her sisters, saying that a person cannot break the laws of causality with their body. Such a thing requires a corresponding price, and the life of an ordinary person is insignificant for that. At the very least, it must be paid for with the heart of a dragon, the mother of nature, which is impossible for a young woman. This was something the reader understood as well, recalling Jason's words. The witch clarified what the high priest had said in response to Alice's question, and she relayed his statement that it would only be possible if the soul remained in its original body, but it was most likely now just an empty shell, making a return unrealistic. But then Medea conspiratorially winked, offering something else, an option where it would be possible to leave the world without breaking its laws. The witch explained that the law of cause and effect itself is a rule according to which a living being must complete its mission, a mission that was originally prescribed by this world. It is the same principle by which heroes arise in troubled times. Some are born to save the world, while others live and die to give another a reason to do so. A precise mechanism in which, if one part breaks, the entire world collapses. Its preservation depends on this law, and a tremendous price must be paid for its violation. In response to the stranger's question about what awaits those who fulfill their task, Medea answered that they die, but with official permission to do so, for before completing their mission, death is simply impossible for them. The reader knew Alice's purpose perfectly well, to kill Helena for the sake of revenge. Medea asked if the stranger knew the reason for Lady Miserian's existence in this world, and the girl remembered that after Entabol's death, she would already be sentenced to execution, meaning she herself had to move toward her own death. She asked how the witch could help her without violating the law of causality, and Medea replied that after death, the soul is reborn in the same world, and after Alice's death, the reader would be reincarnated here according to the rules of this world. Only witches can break laws and rules, but for that, several sacrifices will be required to return the stranger to her true home. At once, the anxious question came, what sacrifices would have to be made? To which Medea squinted mysteriously, inspecting her client, and carelessly, with a laugh, she said that she hadn't yet learned all the details. Alice gloomily flopped onto the bed after the foolish joke, while Medea tried to cheer her up, assuring her that she and her sisters would soon clarify all the details of the matter. But this didn't offer much reassurance to the stranger, considering Hybris's words that no one had ever left this world alive, and that even witches struggled to find a solution. As she started to wonder if the reward was too little, the girl from the mirror assured her that the payment would be taken later. After all, she had drunk the contract at their first meeting. At first, Alice didn't understand what she meant, but then she remembered the mysterious drink she had drunk from the bowl. Medea advised her not to put everything into her mouth that strangers offer, before the girl, in a fit of rage, jumped up and declared that it was unfair since she hadn't known its contents. However, the witch declared that it was all fair. After all, now they held each other's lives in their hands. She promised to contact her client as soon as something was known, and reminded her to carry this means of communication with her, also warning that if she got into serious trouble, she should find the largest mirror. After that, her image disappeared. After such a flood of information, Alice felt completely drained, and a thought flashed through her mind that she hadn't seen her new knight since arriving at the estate. Had they given him a proper room? In a half-sleep, the girl whispered his name, and the door immediately opened, admitting Anakin, who startled his mistress. She was surprised that he could hear her, and immediately became worried if he now knew about her conversation with Medea. Her ladyship allowed the young man to enter her room, and he knelt before her at the bed, declaring one of the knight's main moral principles, to never reveal his master's secrets. This confirmed her suspicions that he had heard everything, and such a sharp ear could only belong to two types of people in this world. Since he was not a magical engineer, the girl decided to ask him if he was a sword master, to which she received a foolish and ambiguous answer. She clarified how, to a question that could only have a yes or no answer, he could say almost. And Anakin explained that he could read signs of presence, but could not unlock the energy of a sword, which excluded the possibility of him being a sword master. Lady Miserian frowned, returning to the fact that he had heard everything, and asked the semi-master what he thought about it. In her mind, thoughts were already forming on how to deal with him if he decided to accuse Alice of being involved with the witch, slander him as a liar, or kill him right away. However, the knight chose to clarify if he understood correctly that his mistress was not from this world. As much as Alice didn't want to admit it, since she had decided to treat him as her confidant, there was no other choice. She acknowledged this, approaching the window in her room, but clarified that it was not Lady Miserian, but the soul in her body, the foreigner. Anakin, asking if she wanted to return, and receiving an affirmative answer, made it clear that he was ready to help her. The girl furrowed her brows slightly, turning to the knight, not understanding his calmness after such a confession that his mistress was from another world, and moreover, a criminal who had violated the prohibition on contact with witches. From her skeptical glance, Anakin understood that she suspected him of thinking she was crazy for not considering her insane after all the nonsense he had heard, but he assured her that, after living in the narrow alleys where every third person points at the world and accuses it of madness, it's impossible to distinguish what has truly gone mad and what hasn't. One could say that's what makes life more interesting, for that is exactly what it is. With such logic, one can't enjoy it without being labeled as crazy by someone's opinion. After these words, Alice even began to doubt if he was truly human, and she hurriedly approached him, placing her hand on his warm cheek, confirming that he was alive. Unperturbed, Anakin continued, saying that he didn't care who she was because it wouldn't change his duties or his oath. Lady Miserian asked what she needed to do, and the knight replied that she needed to command, and he would obey and carry out her orders without question. Alice returned to her bed. She had heard everything she needed to be sure that such a person wouldn't break his duties because of deep feelings. Even if they were to manifest toward Helena, his loyalty would remain with his mistress. The knight tensed, wondering if she was disappointed by his confession that, in his own way, he had also gone mad. But the girl smiled at him and said that, on the contrary, she liked it very much. The next day also began in this world with its silly laws, but today would be different from the rest. Accompanied by her knight, Lady Miserian warned that she was heading to Lauter, the largest confectionery in the entire country. She had dressed like a commoner on purpose to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to her person. Inside, she met her little savior, who, as it turned out, had been very eager to see Alice. It turned out that she had finally learned where the priest, whom the girl had sent to search for, was living, and finally, she had been able to catch his trail.